You're standing around a fire. It's 50,000 BC. The sun just went down. There's no Netflix, there's no phone, there's no existential dread about your inbox. There's just you, the flames, and the thick choking smoke curling directly into your face. And somewhere, at some point, one of your ancestors looked at that smoke and thought, wait, what if I did that on purpose? This is the story of how humans discovered smoking. Not cigarettes, not cigars, not the guy outside the office, who you always end up talking to for too long. We're talking about the very first time a human being intentionally inhaled something burning, and why that might be one of the oldest habits our species has ever had. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Smoking doesn't start with tobacco. It doesn't start with colonial trade routes or Native American ceremonies or even agriculture. The desire to inhale smoke might be hardwired into us on a level so deep it predates civilization entirely. And the evidence for this is genuinely insane. Let's start with fire. Because before you can smoke anything, you need fire. And fire has been part of the human story for a very, very long time. The oldest confirmed evidence of controlled fire used by our ancestors dates back roughly 1 million years, from a site called Wonderwork Cave in South Africa. Archaeologists found burnt plant ash and charred bone, not the result of a wildfire, but of a sustained, contained fire used deliberately inside a cave. Now, 1 million years ago, we weren't even Homo sapiens yet. That was Homo erectus. Our earlier cousin with a smaller brain, a heavier brow ridge, and absolutely zero interest in being told what to do with it. They sat around fires just like we do. They cooked, they stayed warm, they huddled together in the dark, and they breathed smoke. Every single day, for hundreds of thousands of years, every human and pre-human ancestor who sat near a fire inhaled smoke. It was unavoidable. It was constant. It was basically the original air quality situation, and nobody had an app to check it. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of that smoke wasn't just wood smoke. When you burn organic matter, you don't just get carbon dioxide and water vapor. You get a cocktail of compounds depending entirely on what you're burning. Some plants, when combusted, release psychoactive chemicals, alkaloids, terpenes, compounds that interact with the human nervous system in ways that are, let's say, noticeable. In other words, some of our ancestors were absolutely, accidentally getting high around the campfire, and they had no idea why they suddenly felt amazing. This isn't a fringe theory. Researchers have proposed for decades that early humans living in forested environments would have been regularly exposed to the smoke of psychoactive plants like cannabis, wild Nicotiana species, and various entheogens that grow naturally across Africa, Europe, and Asia. The human brain, it turns out, has receptors that respond to cannabinoids. These receptors didn't evolve because of cannabis. They're part of our endocannabinoid system, which regulates everything from mood to memory to appetite. But the fact that they exist means that when a human first inhaled smoke from a burning cannabis plant, their brain wasn't confused. Their brain was like, oh, hello, I've been waiting for you. And that moment, that first accidental hit of psychoactive smoke around a prehistoric campfire, might be the true origin of smoking. Not a decision, not a plan. Just a very pleasant accident that was repeated enough times that someone eventually thought to recreate it on purpose. Think about that for a second. The entire multi-trillion-dollar global tobacco industry, the centuries of ritual, the shamanic traditions, the medical practices, the social customs, all of it may have started because a tired hunter sat downwind of the wrong bush and had a really unexpectedly great evening. History is sometimes beautiful in the most absurd ways. Now here's where we have to be careful about timelines. Because ancient humans accidentally inhaling smoke and ancient humans intentionally cultivating plants to smoke are very different claims. Let's talk about what the archaeology actually tells us. The oldest direct evidence of intentional cannabis use, meaning burned cannabis seeds found in a context that clearly suggests deliberate inhalation, comes from a burial site in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia, dating to around 500 BC. Excavators found wooden braziers containing stones that had been superheated alongside residue from cannabis plants with unusually high THC content. This wasn't wild cannabis grown for fiber or rope. This was the good stuff, placed directly in a ritual burial context. 500 BC. That's roughly 2,500 years ago. But here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. Does the absence of older physical evidence mean it didn't happen earlier? Or does it just mean we haven't found it yet? Because organic material, seeds, leaves, plant fiber almost never survives thousands of years in the ground. We find stone tools from 3 million years ago because stone is basically indestructible. But a wooden pipe filled with dried herbs? Gone in a few centuries under normal burial conditions. A leather pouch of cannabis dissolved back into the earth long before any archaeologist showed up with a trowel. So the absence of evidence in this case is absolutely not the evidence of absence. And then there's the Herodotus problem. Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian writing in the 5th century BC, described in remarkable detail the Scythians, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe, performing what he called a vapor bath. They would set up small enclosed tents, heat stones until they glow, throw hemp seeds directly onto those stones, and then sit inside inhaling the smoke. And as Herodotus wrote, howling with pleasure. For centuries, historians assumed he was exaggerating, or that he'd misunderstood what he saw. Then archaeologists started excavating Scythian burial mounds and finding, you guessed it, bronze braziers, heated stones, and hemp residue. Exactly what Herodotus described. The man was just reporting what he saw. He wasn't embellishing. He was, if anything, underselling it, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question. How many other ancient accounts of strange rituals involving smoke and plants have historians quietly dismissed as exaggeration, only for archaeologists to later dig up the literal physical evidence that the ancient writers were telling the truth the whole time? Probably more than a few. Let's talk about tobacco, because it's the one most people actually associate with smoking. Tobacco is a plant in the genus Nicotiana, and it's native to the Americas. That matters enormously because it means tobacco was completely unknown to Old World civilizations, to Europe, Africa, Asia, until contact with the Americas in the late 15th century. When European explorers arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, they immediately noticed indigenous people doing something they had never seen before. Columbus himself wrote in his journal about men and women walking around with small glowing sticks, inhaling smoke from burning dried leaves and exhaling it back out through their mouths and noses. His crew was baffled. His crew also, within weeks, tried it themselves. Because of course they did. But tobacco use in the Americas is far, far older than 1492. Archaeological evidence of tobacco, specifically chemical residues found inside ancient pipes, has been dated back to at least 3,500 years ago in the southeastern United States. Some researchers think it could go back considerably further, possibly 10,000 years or more, tied to the early development of cultivation practices in the Amazon basin. And here's the thing about tobacco in ancient America. It was not recreational. Not primarily. It was sacred. Tobacco was used in healing rituals, in communication with the spirit world, in binding agreements between groups. Blowing smoke on someone was an act of blessing, of connection, of deep respect. A shaman who smoked wasn't taking a casual break. He was opening a channel between the living and something beyond it. The smoke itself was considered a living carrier, a messenger that moved between worlds, carrying prayers upward and bringing visions back down. That framing matters. It explains why tobacco use was so disciplined, so ritualized, and so carefully controlled in many indigenous cultures for thousands of years. When something is sacred, you treat it with reverence. You don't chain smoke it during a mid-afternoon slump. The idea of tobacco as a casual everyday habit, something you do on a lunch break or outside a bar in the cold, is an almost entirely European invention, and a fairly recent one at that. Now, let's go back even further, because there's a piece of this story that most people have genuinely never heard, and it might be the oldest evidence of intentional smoking in the entire archaeological record. In 2019, researchers made a remarkable discovery at a site in the Great Salt Lake Desert in Utah. They found a hearth, a cooking and heating fire, roughly 12,000 years old, containing seeds of Nicotiana attenuata, a wild tobacco species native to North America. These weren't seeds that had blown into the fire by accident. They were concentrated, present in a way that strongly suggested deliberate placement. The site predates any known pottery or pipe artifacts in the region by thousands of years, 12,000 years old, before any of the technology we normally associate with girls. Anized, smoking, even existed. This pushed back the possible timeline of tobacco use in the Americas by a significant margin, and it raised a genuinely fascinating question. If people were deliberately throwing tobacco into fires 12,000 years ago, whether to inhale the smoke or for ritual purposes or both, what were people in other parts of the world doing with their own local psychoactive plants at exactly the same time? Because 12,000 years ago, humans were everywhere. Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia, and the human desire to alter consciousness, to actively seek out changed mental states, that is not an American phenomenon. That is a human phenomenon. Full stop. Let me throw something at you that might sound wild but is taken seriously by respected anthropologists. The Intoxication Hypothesis. The basic argument goes like this. Across virtually every human culture ever documented, people have sought out ways to alter their consciousness. They've drunk fermented beverages, eaten psychedelic mushrooms, inhaled smoke, chewed plant leaves, and swallowed seeds. This behavior is so universal, so persistent, and so independently repeated across cultures with no contact with each other that some researchers believe it isn't accidental. Ronald Siegel, a psychopharmacologist at UCLA, proposed in the 1980s that the pursuit of intoxication is a fourth drive, alongside hunger, thirst, and sex, that is biologically embedded in animal behavior. Not just human behavior, animal behavior. Elephants deliberately seek out fermented marula fruit. Reindeer in Siberia have been observed eating Amanita muscaria mushrooms and then drinking the urine of other reindeer who ate the mushrooms, because the psychoactive compounds pass through the body, essentially intact. Reindeer doing drug recycling in Siberia. Honestly, respect. The point is, if the drive to alter consciousness is this deep and this old, it's entirely reasonable to propose that early humans, long before they domesticated any plant, long before they had pottery or pipes or any of the tools we normally associate with smoking, were deliberately exposing themselves to psychoactive smoke because they had learned through experience that it changed something in their mind in a way they wanted to repeat. Maybe they burned those plants intentionally during rituals. Maybe they selected campsites near specific plant species for exactly this reason. Maybe they learned which smoke made you feel open and warm and connected, and which made you feel like you were dying, which with some plants is a distinction that kills you once before you figure it out. This is trial and error, prehistoric style, very high stakes, occasionally, literally fatal. But the ones who survived remembered. They told others. They passed it down through generations of accumulated knowledge that never got written but got lived. That's how most human knowledge worked for most of human history, not libraries, not schools. Lived experience, passed mouth to ear, around a fire, in the dark. Let's also talk about something that rarely comes up in this conversation. Smoking as medicine. Long before it was recreational, long before it was spiritual, it may have been medical. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest known medical documents in existence, dates to ancient Egypt around 1550 BC. It describes treatments involving the inhalation of smoke from heated herbs, specifically for conditions affecting the throat and respiratory system. This is wildly counterintuitive from a modern perspective. You're telling me the ancient Egyptians treated lung problems by making patients inhale smoke? Yes, they were. And while that seems completely insane, it's worth noting that the specific plants they used, including henbane and various aromatic herbs, do have genuine pharmacological properties when inhaled. They weren't just guessing randomly. Hippocrates, the guy whose name gets attached to a medical oath, wrote about the inhalation of herbal vapors to treat diseases of the lungs and other conditions. The thinking wasn't irrational by the standards of the time. Smoke reaches the lungs directly, so if a plant has medicinal properties, delivering it via combustion makes a certain logical sense. The lungs as a delivery mechanism. Inhaled medicine. We still do this today with asthma inhalers and anesthetic gases and nebulizers. The delivery method survived across 3,000 years of medical history. The burning part, thankfully, mostly didn't. Ancient Indian Ayurvedic medicine, dating back over 3,000 years, describes a practice called dhumapana, which translates roughly as smoke drinking, involving the deliberate inhalation of medicinal herbs through specialized pipes. The texts are detailed. Specific plants, specific conditions, specific preparations. This wasn't casual improvisation. It was a sophisticated medical system with detailed protocols and centuries of refinement baked in. Across ancient China, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, ancient India, in virtually every early civilization with surviving records, there is evidence of people inhaling smoke deliberately as a recognized medical practice. Not because they were addicted, not because it was fashionable, because it worked, or at least it worked sometimes, or at least it worked enough times that practitioners kept reaching for it. And in a world without antibiotics, without surgical intervention, without anything resembling what modern medicine takes for granted, work sometimes was a genuinely meaningful bar to clear. It got you to the next treatment. That was the whole game. There's another angle to this story that almost never gets the attention it deserves, and it has to do with social bonding. Humans are deeply social animals. We evolved in groups, and group cohesion, the ability to stay together, trust each other, and act in coordination, was literally a matter of survival for almost our entire evolutionary history. Isolated individuals died. Groups survived. Anything that genuinely enhanced social bonding had real survival value. And shared rituals, including the shared consumption of psychoactive substances, are extraordinarily powerful tools for building exactly that kind of cohesion. When a group of people undergo a shared altered experience together, it creates a sense of connection and mutual trust that is very difficult to replicate through any other mechanism. Modern neuroscience has actually confirmed this in measurable terms. Shared rituals synchronize neural activity between participants, increase interpersonal trust, and deepen group identity in documented, reproducible ways. So when a group of ancient humans sat together in a closed space, breathing smoke from burning cannabis or other psychoactive herbs, and collectively entered an altered state, that wasn't just a party. That was social technology. That was the mechanism by which you built the kind of deep, embodied trust that let you go into dangerous situations alongside other people and actually come back alive. The ritual smoke circle wasn't recreation, it was infrastructure. It was the prehistoric equivalent of the kind of institutional trust building that modern organizations spend enormous amounts of money trying to replicate in corporate retreat settings, with considerably less impressive results. Here's where we arrive at the genuinely uncomfortable part of the story. The transition from sacred smoke to casual consumer habit is historically an absolute disaster. When tobacco arrived in Europe in the 16th century, it spread with a speed that should remind you of something. Within decades, smoking had gone from an exotic curiosity to a continental obsession. By the 1600s, tobacco was being traded globally. By the 1700s, snuff, powdered tobacco inhaled directly through the nose, was fashionable across European aristocracy, which is a sentence you really have to sit with for a moment. By the 1800s, cigars were everywhere. By the early 1900s, the industrially manufactured cigarette had been invented, making tobacco consumption cheaper, more convenient, and more addictive than anything to cac injection. Cheaper, more convenient, and more addictive than anything definite. Hat had come before it. What had taken Indigenous Americans thousands of years to incorporate into a measured, ritualistic, deeply cultural practice was, in the hands of European industrial capitalism, transformed into a mass-market consumer product within 4 centuries. That is a genuinely staggering compression of history. The tobacco industry in the 20th century then spent decades and billions of dollars actively suppressing the evidence that cigarettes caused cancer. Evidence that their own internal scientists had compiled and flagged. They marketed cigarettes to children. They hired physicians to publicly endorse their products. They added chemical compounds specifically engineered to make nicotine hit faster, harder, and leave the system more rapidly, deliberately maximizing the addictive loop. They took something ancient and ritualistic and communal and redesigned it from the ground up to be as physically destructive and financially extractive as possible. A shaman and a tobacco company executive both worked with the same plant. They had almost nothing else in common. The gap between a ritual practitioner in 500 BC, carefully placing cannabis on heated stones in a burial ceremony, and a tobacco company executive in 1960 signing off on a marketing campaign aimed at teenagers is one of the larger moral chasms in the entire human record. Both involve smoke. Almost nothing else is the same. It's worth pausing on that, because the story of smoking is often told as a single continuous thread, as if the Scythians howling in their tents and the Marlboro Man are part of the same narrative arc. They're not. Something fundamental was lost in translation somewhere around the 16th century, and it was never recovered. So when did humans actually start smoking? The honest answer is we don't know exactly, and we probably never will. The physical evidence takes us back 12,000 years with reasonable confidence, and probably much further with well-supported speculation. The behavioral drive underneath smoking, the desire to alter consciousness, to share ritual experiences, to use inhaled substances as medicine, to build trust through shared altered states, is almost certainly far older than any artifact we've ever dug out of the ground. It may be as old as fire itself. It may be as old as the cognitive leap that made us recognizably human in the first place, the ability to connect cause and effect. To look at a burning plant and think, last time that happened, I felt different. Let me do that again. That's no X to addiction. That's intelligence. What we do know is this. The behavior is extraordinarily old. It predates agriculture. It predates pottery. It predates every civilization you've ever learned about in any classroom. By the time the historical record begins, in every corner of the world where humans had established themselves, they were already finding ways to put smoke into their bodies. The specific plants differed by region. The rituals differed by culture. The stated purposes, whether medical or spiritual or social, differed by context. But the behavior itself, the behavior was already ancient by the time anyone thought to write it down. It was already old when Herodotus was taking notes on the Scythians. It was already old when the Egyptian physicians were compiling the Ebers Papyrus. It was already old when Columbus watched people on a Caribbean beach doing something his entire civilization had never imagined. There's something almost worth sitting with quietly in that realization. For all the things that separate modern humans from our deepest ancestors, the technology, the medicine, the accumulated knowledge, the truly extraordinary amount of content we manage to consume on a daily basis, there are these thin, unbroken threads of continuity that run straight through 100,000 years of human experience. Fire, smoke, breath. The oldest humans sat around fires and breathed the same smoky air you'd smell standing near a bonfire tonight. Some of them, at some point, started paying attention to what that smoke was actually doing to them, and then they started choosing it, and then they started passing that choice forward to the next generation, and the next, and eventually to the Scythians howling in their tents, and the Egyptian physicians prescribing henbane, and the shamans reading the rising smoke, and the people on a Caribbean beach watching baffled Europeans try tobacco for the first time, and cough until their eyes watered. The next time you catch a whiff of wood smoke on a cold night and feel something ancient and unnameable move through you, something that's hard to explain and harder to dismiss, that's not nostalgia. That's not poetry. That might actually be memory. Not your memory, something older than that. Encoded not in language but in the body itself, in receptors that have been waiting patiently in your nervous system since long before anyone had a word for what they were responding to. 12,000 years of deliberate use. A million years of accidental exposure before that. And built into your brain the whole time, a system perfectly designed to say yes. That's the answer to when humans started smoking. Not a date, not a discovery, a recognition. One that's been happening, in one form or another, ever since the first fire went dark, and someone leaned a little closer to the smoke